The psychodynamic approach. So we need to be aware of the role of the unconscious, the structure of personality, so id, ego, superego, defense mechanisms, so repression, denial and displacement, and psychosexual stages. So the role of the unconscious. So the idea is that the human mind is broken down into three broad parts, sometimes referred to as the iceberg analogy. So the conscious is what we are aware of, the tip of the iceberg. So every thought and feeling that we are aware of and we can access. Our pre-conscious is where we become aware of our unconscious through dreams or slips of the tongue. So dream analysis, according to Freud, and dreams are ways in which our unconsciousness is coming through. Now our unconscious is that bottom bit of the iceberg, the bit below the sea that we cannot access, and that's our storehouse of our biological drives and instincts. So it's these drives and innate instincts that influence our behaviour, according to Freud. Now he believes that the structure of personality was in three different structures, so the id, the ego and the superego, and it is an interaction between these three parts that determines our behaviour. So the first to develop, or the first that is present from birth, is the id, and this is the primitive part of our personality. It works on the pleasure principle and it demands instant gratification. So it is very selfish in its desires, it's innate, it's present from birth, it's selfish, it's the I want pleasure principle. The ego develops around the age of 2 and is our reality principle, and it works as a mediator between the id and the superego. So it tries to balance the id and the superego so one of them isn't dominant, and it uses defense mechanisms as a way to help any conflicts. Now the superego develops at around the age of 5 and is formed during the end of the phallic stage, and it internalises a sense of what is right and wrong. So it's our morality principle, and it results in us feelings of guilt and shame. Now the way that I try to remember it is like the id is that is almost like the devil on your shoulder. It's the one that's trying to get you to do things and is very selfish. I'll just do that, I want that. Whereas the superego is almost like the angel, the one that is trying to be like, no, don't do that, it's not moral, it's not correct. And the ego is trying to balance those two opposing characteristics so one of them doesn't end up dominant. Because if one of those is dominant, you can result in different personality traits. Defense mechanisms, so as I said, if the id threatens to overwhelm the ego or superego, the defense mechanisms are triggered by the ego, and they help to protect the individual from anxiety. And the three that you need to be aware about are denial, repression and displacement. Now denial is where you refuse to accept reliability or believe that something is happening. So your exams are coming up but you're not doing revision, you're in denial that they're actually going to take place. Repression is the unconscious blocking of unacceptable thoughts and impulses. So if something traumatic happens to an individual, they might not be able to remember what happened. They have blocked that from their memory. Displacement is where you redirect the feelings onto an innocent person or object. So if you have an argument with someone and then you slam the door, that is displacement. You're taking out that anger onto the door rather than onto the person that you are angry with. Now the psychosexual stages. So Freud believes that everyone goes through these 5 psychosexual stages, and they happen in this set order and they happen at different time periods. If a particularly traumatic event or unresolved conflict happens during that stage, then a person will become fixated at that stage and it will result in certain characteristics. Now to help you remember the 5 stages and the order they go in, think of the acrostic or the acronym old age pensioners like Guinness. So oral, anal, phallic, latency and genital. So during the oral stage, the focus of pleasure is on the mouth. So this is where a baby is learning to breastfeed and feed. So chewing, sucking and biting are sources of pleasure, and they reduce any tension in the infant. Now, if something happens during that stage, so some conflict, it could result in smoking, biting nails, being sarcastic and overly critical. Now, the anal stage is during the age of where you're beginning to be potty trained. The child is realising that they can control their bowel movements and they are in control of their sphincter, so when they can and can't go to the toilet. Now, this can result in two traits. So either anally retentive, so a person is a perfectionist, obsessive, very neat, very tidy, or anally expulsive, they are messy and thoughtless and a hoarder. The phallic stage is where the focus moves onto the genital areas, and the child will either experience the epidipus or the electra complex. So the epidipus complex is what boys go through, and at this, the complex is they desire their mother, but they are worried that their dad will find out, and they are worried that if dad finds out, they will be castrated, so they develop castration anxiety, and therefore they identify with the dad, so they mimic his behaviour, they identify with him in order to prevent dad from finding out they desire their mother. The electra complex is where girls desire their father, and they develop penis envy because they believe that the penis is a superior sex organ, and they blame their mothers for not giving them a penis. So a way to resolve that complex is they turn that desire for a penis into a desire for a baby. Now, Freud says that if conflict happens at this stage or some trauma, they will develop a phallic personality, so they become narcissistic, reckless and possibly homosexual. Latency is where earlier conflicts are repressed, and then the final stage is around the onset of puberty, so sexual desires become conscious alongside the onset of puberty. Freud says that if you become fixated at this stage, there could be difficulty in forming heterosexual relationships. So we have different sort of questions here. So describe the structure of personality according to the psychodynamic approach. So you'd talk about the idea it's in three parts: the id, ego and superego. The id is our pleasure-seeking principle present from birth, quite selfish in its nature. The ego is the mediator between the id and the superego, and develops around the age of 2, and it triggers defense mechanisms. And then the superego is the morality principle, the idea of what is right and wrong, can make a person feel guilty, and is generally developed at the end of the phallic stage, so around the age of 5. Application question: explain how the superego might affect moral behaviour in the following situation. Jackie sees a t-shirt that she really likes in the store. She is aware that there is no security cameras nearby and thinks how easy it would be to slip the t-shirt in her bag. So you could go down two different routes. You can either talk about if her superego was dominant, or if her superego wasn't dominant and the id was in charge. So if her superego was dominant, she would be acting on the morality principle, and therefore she would go and buy the t-shirt because she would feel guilty for stealing it. If the id was dominant and the superego wasn't fully developed, she would be acting on gratification principle, the pleasure principle, and she would be more likely to put the t-shirt in her bag because there's no security cameras and walk out of the shop because her superego isn't developing that sense of what is right or wrong. So in terms of some evaluation then, so we have some supporting evidence that unconscious motivations in our behaviour and defence mechanisms are valid. So the idea of repression, denial and displacement have been suggested to be correct. There is gender bias. So Freud was ignorant of female sexuality. He based his theories on male sexual development as the norm, so therefore it is gender bias. He also argues that males are more moral than females, or they have more developed superego because they go through the electric complex, whereas males go through the Oedipus complex, whereas females go through the electric complex, and therefore males have a more dominant and developed superego. It's got psychic determinism, so it believes that all behaviour is determined by unconscious conflicts, so it doesn't take into account the idea that we have any free will. It's a very extreme position, whereas other approaches would argue that we do have free will, in particular the humanistic approach, and in terms of the cognitive approach argues that we have some free will in that we can learn to adapt our thought processes through CBT. It offers useful treatment, so it's the first to propose psychological treatment for depression and anxiety, so the talking cure, psychoanalysis, dream analysis and free association. Also, it's not testable in the slightest, so it's based on unfalsifiable methods, so we can't actually test the idea of defense mechanisms or the unconscious part of the mind. It's impossible to test, so therefore we can't falsify it, meaning it isn't scientific. In terms of a 16 marker, describe the psychodynamic approach in explaining human behaviour, discuss strengths and limitations of this approach. So this 16 marker is being quite prescriptive in its wanting strengths and limitations. Now, it's not always a requirement that you include strengths and limitations in a 16 marker. It doesn't have to be a balanced essay, but this one is asking you to have strengths and limitation in order to reach that top band mark.